Millionaire beats black waitress into bleeding for not serving him well. Korean Mafia boss client makes him pay dearly on his knees. The crystal chandeliers were still swaying when blood hit the marble floor. Aisha Thompson's body crumpled beside the table, her temple bleeding where it struck the edge. The millionaire stood over her, straightening his cufflinks, satisfied that order had been restored. He did not see the shift in the room. He did not notice the two men in black suits moving toward the exits, blocking them quietly. What Victor Hale did not know was that the silent foreign guest he had been trying to impress all evening was not impressed. What he did not know was that violence in the wrong room, witnessed by the wrong man, would cost him everything he had built. What he did not know was that some men do not forgive publicly. They correct privately, methodically, and absolutely. One phone call would freeze his accounts. Another would collapse his pending acquisition. A third would bring police through doors he thought money had sealed. Let us know where you are listening from and what time it is. Leave a comment below. We would truly love to hear from you. Aisha Thompson did not expect the evening to end in blood. She had worked the afternoon shift at Le Marais for 3 years without incident. The restaurant specialized in discretion, catering to power brokers, foreign investors, and men who valued silence as much as service. She was good at her job. Quiet when needed. Precise always. Invisible unless called upon. That evening, the private dining room had been reserved weeks in advance. 3 executives, a foreign dignitary, and their host, Victor Hale. Victor was a self-made millionaire, known equally for his generosity and his temper. He tipped lavishly when pleased. He humiliated staff when he was not. The manager had assigned Aisha specifically because she handled pressure well. The guest of honor arrived last. Korean, impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable. The reservation listed him only as Mr. Kong. No company name. No title. No background. The manager personally oversaw the arrangements, ensuring every detail met the standard expected for someone whose silence suggested importance. The night began smoothly. Wine was poured without spillage. Orders were taken and delivered precisely. Conversation remained low and measured. The kind of careful dialogue that happens when men are negotiating rather than socializing. The mistake was minor. A delay between the second and third courses. A steak plated seconds too early, arriving at the table less hot than Victor preferred. Aisha noticed immediately and apologized, offering to return the dish to the kitchen. That should have ended it. Victor did not respond at first. He cut into the steak, chewed slowly, and set down his knife with deliberate care. The room registered the shift. Conversations at nearby tables quieted. Chairs stopped scraping. When Aisha approached to check if anything else was needed, Victor's smile had vanished. "This is unacceptable," he said, loud enough that diners 3 tables away turned to look. "Do you people not understand basic timing?" Aisha kept her voice steady. She apologized again, calmly, professionally. She offered solutions: a replacement dish, complimentary wine, anything that would restore the evening without escalation. Her training had prepared her for difficult clients. The escalation was part of the job. Victor stood abruptly. His chair scraped backward, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. "You think an apology fixes this?" His voice carried across the room now, performing for an audience he assumed would validate him. Aisha stepped back instinctively, but not quickly enough. Victor grabbed her wrist, not violently at first, just firmly enough to make a point. She tried to pull away. Someone at a nearby table whispered her name in warning. Victor shoved her. The movement was not calculated. It was reactive, fueled by entitlement and unchecked anger. Aisha stumbled backward, her body hitting the table behind her before she fell. The impact knocked the wind from her chest. Her temple struck the marble edge of the table on the way down. Pain exploded through her skull, sharp and immediate. She hit the floor hard. Warmth spread across her cheek. When she raised her hand, her fingers came away red. The room froze completely. Forks stopped midair. Conversations died unfinished. Even the kitchen sounds seemed to cease. Victor looked down at her, breathing hard, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to satisfaction. He believed he had restored order. He believed the room would understand. He believed consequences were for other people. Learn how to serve, he said, his voice steady now, dismissive. He expected validation. Nervous laughter. Managers rushing to smooth over the incident. Apologies directed at him, not at the bleeding woman on his floor. That was how it always went for men like Victor Hale. The silence that followed was different. It was not shocked. It was evaluating. Mr. Kong had not moved. He had not stood, had not spoken, had not reacted visibly to the violence. He simply watched, his gaze moving from Victor to Aisha, then slowly across the room, cataloging every witness, every detail, every second of what had just occurred. Behind him, the two men in black suits shifted position. Not toward Victor. Toward the exits. Blocking them without making it obvious. Their movements were economical, professional, the kind of positioning that comes from training rather than instinct. The manager rushed forward, calling for medical assistance, his face pale with understanding. Other diners reached for their phones, but none raised them openly. This was a room that understood unspoken rules. Recording meant involvement. Involvement meant consequences. Victor straightened his jacket, adjusting his cufflinks as if the blood on the floor was someone else's problem to solve. Let's sit, he said to his guests, gesturing toward the table as though the matter was closed. This is being handled. Mr. Kong finally spoke. His voice was quiet, measured, and absolute. No, he said. It is not. The words landed with weight that silenced even Victor's practiced confidence. Mr. Kong stood slowly, deliberately, each movement controlled. He walked past Victor without acknowledging him, moving directly to where Aisha lay bleeding on the cold marble. He knelt beside her with the kind of care that suggested familiarity with violence and its aftermath. He removed his jacket, folded it once, and placed it gently under her head to cushion her against the floor. He spoke to her directly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You are seen, he said quietly. Stay still. Help is coming. Victor watched, confusion spreading across his face. Who do you think you are? The question came out sharper than he intended, defensive rather than commanding. Mr. Kong rose and turned to face him. His expression had not changed. No anger. No disgust. Just cold assessment. My name is Kong Min-jae, he replied. And this restaurant is under my protection tonight. The words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact. The kind of fact that changes everything that follows. The two men behind Kong stepped forward simultaneously, their movements synchronized and efficient. Their expressions remained neutral, but tattoos crept from beneath their collars. Symbols that Victor suddenly recognized with dawning horror. Korean syndicate. Not rumor. Not myth. Reality standing in his dining room. Victor laughed once, the sound nervous and hollow. Come on. This is a misunderstanding. I can pay for. Kong raised one hand. The room obeyed instantly. Even Victor's voice died mid-sentence. You already paid, Kong said softly. With her blood. What happened next was not chaos. It was orchestrated silence. The private dining room was sealed, not by violence but by presence. Security moved into position at doorways. Phones were collected quietly and placed face down on tables. No one protested. No one argued. The room understood that something larger than individual will was now in motion. The ambulance was permitted entry immediately. Paramedics moved through the controlled space with professional urgency, assessing Aisha's condition, securing her carefully onto a stretcher. She remained conscious but dazed, her eyes wide with shock and confusion as she was carried past tables of witnesses who would not forget what they had seen. Victor was told to sit. He remained standing, his defiance automatic, a lifetime of unquestioned authority still operating on instinct. One of Kang's men placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. Not violently, not aggressively, just firmly, with the kind of pressure that communicated inevitability. Victor's knees buckled. He sank onto a chair, then further, until he was kneeling on the carpet, his tailored suit creasing against the floor. The diners watched. No one moved to intervene. No one spoke in his defense. Kong circled Victor slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice remaining quiet and controlled throughout. This is not about revenge, he said. It is about balance. Hello, my friends and loved ones. Thanks for joining me on this beautiful story. As we continue this story, kindly take a moment to subscribe to this channel, like the video, and I love to always hear from you. Where are you watching from and what time is it at your end right now? Thank you for subscribing. Aisha Thompson had worked the afternoon shift at Le Marais for 3 years without incident. She understood the unspoken rules of establishments like this. Discretion was currency, silence was professional, and certain clients expected the world to arrange itself around their moods. She had learned early that surviving in high-end service meant reading a room faster than anyone else, anticipating problems before they announced themselves, and never, ever making a scene. Victor Hale had built his fortune on a simple principle. Rooms bent to him, or they broke. Boardrooms, courtrooms, dining rooms. It made no difference. He had spent 2 decades conditioning the world to respond to his presence with deference or fear, preferably both. Staff existed to execute his will perfectly. Any deviation was not a mistake, it was disrespect. And disrespect required correction. Tonight, he had brought associates he needed to impress. Men whose investment could expand his already considerable empire. The Korean guest, Mr. Kong, represented interests Victor did not fully understand, but desperately wanted access to. Everything needed to be flawless. When it was not, someone would pay for it. The dining room had registered the shift in temperature the moment Victor stood. Conversations at nearby tables trailed off mid-sentence. A woman in a burgundy dress set down her wineglass carefully, her eyes fixed on the scene developing 3 tables away. An older gentleman folded his napkin with deliberate slowness, his expression hardening with recognition. They had seen this before, perhaps not here, perhaps not this violent, but they knew the shape of what was coming. The staff froze in practiced stillness. A waiter near the kitchen door stopped mid-step, his tray balanced perfectly, his face carefully blank. Another server pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible. They understood instinctively that intervention meant becoming the next target. Survival in service meant knowing when to witness and when to vanish. The manager stood near the entrance to the private dining area, his mind already calculating. Medical liability, police reports, reputation management, potential lawsuits, whether to call security or wait. Whether this was the kind of incident that could be smoothed over with money, or the kind that would end careers. His hand hovered near his phone, frozen in the space between action and consequences. Aisha had remained calm throughout the escalation, her voice steady even as Victor's volume increased. She apologized without groveling. She offered solutions without panic. She maintained the professional composure that had kept her employed in rooms where composure was the only armor available to people like her. But Victor was not interested in solutions. He was interested in dominance. Do you know who I am? The question came out sharp, performative, designed for the audience he assumed was on his side. Do you understand what happens to people who waste my time? Aisha kept her eyes level. Sir, I apologize for the delay. I can have the kitchen. I don't want the kitchen. Victor's voice rose another octave. I want competence. I want respect. I want people who understand their place. He stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell his cologne. Expensive and overwhelming. Close enough that stepping back would look like fear. She held her ground, her hands clasped in front of her, every muscle in her body preparing for what her experience told her was coming next. You people think you can treat clients like this? Victor's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Not violently yet, but firmly enough to make his point physical. You think there are no consequences? Aisha tried to pull back gently, professionally. Sir, please. The shove came fast. Victor released her wrist and pushed, both hands against her shoulders. All his frustration channeled into a single motion meant to establish dominance. Aisha stumbled backward, her body already off balance. The table behind her caught her hip first, spinning her slightly. Her temple struck the marble edge with a sound that cut through the silence. Sharp, final, undeniable. She hit the floor hard. The pain arrived in waves. Her head, her hip, her palms where she tried to catch herself. Warmth spread across her cheek. She touched her face instinctively, her fingers coming away red. The blood looked darker against her skin under the soft restaurant lighting. The silence that followed was absolute. No gasps. No movement. Just collective held breath and the realization settling over everyone present that they had just witnessed something that could not be undone. Victor straightened, adjusted his cufflinks, and looked around the room with an expression that expected validation. He had restored order. He had reminded everyone of how hierarchy worked. He waited for the nervous laughter, the averted eyes, the unspoken agreement that powerful men were allowed their moments of excess. The silence refused to cooperate. Mr. Kong remained seated, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. But his eyes had moved from his plate to Aisha on the floor, then slowly to Victor, cataloging everything with the kind of attention that suggested calculation rather than shock. Behind him, his two men shifted position almost imperceptibly. Their hands moved from resting on the table to resting at their sides. Their weight shifted forward slightly, ready without being obvious. Their faces remained neutral, but their bodies had made a decision the room was only beginning to understand. The silence stretched, and in that silence, power began its quiet migration from the man standing to the man still seated, watching, waiting, deciding what came next. Kong Min-jae had learned patience in rooms where impatience meant death. He had learned observation in environments where missing a detail meant losing everything. And he had learned, above all else, that power expressed through violence was the weakest kind, loud, desperate, and ultimately temporary. He did not move immediately, because movement would suggest reaction. Reaction suggested emotion. Emotion suggested vulnerability. Instead, he watched Victor Hale stand over the bleeding woman with satisfaction on his face, watch the room hold its collective breath, watch the other diners calculate whether their silence made them complicit or protected. Kong had built his authority on a code that men like Victor would never understand. Those who serve deserve protection, not abuse. Waitstaff, drivers, cleaners, security. They move through the world making it function for people who rarely acknowledge their existence. To harm them was not just cruelty. It was a fundamental violation of the order that kept civilized society from collapsing into chaos. Victor had just revealed everything Kong needed to know about him. Not in his wealth. Not in his connections. In his assumption that violence against someone powerless would be forgiven because he was powerful. Kang's gaze remained steady on Victor, cataloging. The way he adjusted his cufflinks. The way he scanned the room for validation. The way his chest still heaved slightly from the exertion and adrenaline. A man performing dominance for an audience he believed would applaud. The manager finally broke from his paralysis, rushing forward with his phone already in his hand. His voice came out higher than intended, strained with the panic of someone watching their career unravel in real time. "I'm calling for help," he said to no one and everyone. "Medical assistance is on the way. Please everyone, remain calm." He knelt near Aisha but did not touch her, afraid of liability, afraid of making anything worse, afraid of the lawsuit that was already forming in the back of his mind. His fingers trembled as he dialed. His words to the emergency dispatcher tumbled out rapid and barely coherent. "Unconscious woman bleeding, assault Le Marais, hurry please hurry." Kong stood then. Not quickly. Not dramatically. He simply rose from his chair with the controlled grace of someone who had never needed to announce his movements. He walked past Victor without acknowledging him, without making eye contact, as though the man standing there breathing hard and expecting confrontation was simply not worth the energy of recognition. He moved directly to where Aisha lay, her hand still pressed against her bleeding temple, her eyes struggling to focus on the ceiling above her. He lowered himself to one knee beside her, his expensive suit making contact with the floor without hesitation. He removed his jacket, folded it once with precise care, and placed it gently beneath her head to cushion her against the cold marble. His voice, when he spoke to her, was quiet enough that only she could hear. The tone was not pitying, not patronizing, simply human addressing human. "You are seen," he said. "Stay still. Help is coming. You are not alone." Aisha's eyes found his face. Confusion flickered there, then something else. Recognition that someone with power had chosen to kneel rather than stand over her. That someone had seen her not as staff, but as a person bleeding on a floor who deserved dignity. Victor's voice shattered the moment. sharp with disbelief and rising panic disguised as indignation. Who do you think you are? The question came out louder than he intended, defensive rather than commanding. This is none of your business. She's clumsy. She fell. This is. Kong rose smoothly, turned to face Victor and waited. He did not interrupt. He did not speak over him. He simply stood there, allowing Victor's words to fill the space and reveal their own emptiness. When Victor finally stopped, running out of justifications, Kong spoke. His voice remained quiet, measured, carrying across the silent room with more authority than any shout could have achieved. My name is Kong Min-jae, he said. Each word deliberate, separated by just enough space to let meaning settle. And this restaurant is under my protection tonight. The words landed without threat, without raised voice, without physical posturing. They were simply stated as fact. The kind of fact that changes the architecture of reality. Victor laughed. The sound came out nervous, hollow, a reflexive attempt to dismiss what his instincts were already beginning to understand. He looked to his other guests for support, for shared amusement at this dramatic stranger making theatrical claims. No one laughed with him. No one met his eyes. Come on, Victor said, his voice pitching higher. This is a misunderstanding. I can pay for whatever, medical bills, damages, whatever you think. Kong raised one hand. Not aggressively, not threateningly, just a simple gesture, palm forward, requesting silence. The room obeyed instantly. Victor's mouth closed mid-sentence. The nervous laughter died in his throat. Even the ambient sounds of the restaurant seemed to quiet, as though the building itself had decided to listen. Kang's hand remained raised for one moment longer, establishing that obedience was not optional. Then he lowered it slowly, his expression unchanged, his eyes never leaving Victor's face. In that silence, Victor Hale finally understood that the room had already chosen sides. And he was standing on the wrong one. The two men in black suits moved with practiced efficiency. They did not rush. They did not speak. They simply positioned themselves at the entrances to the private dining area. One at the main door, one at the service entrance near the kitchen. Their presence transformed exits into boundaries. The message was clear without being stated. No one was leaving until this was resolved. One of them approached the nearest table and extended his hand, palm up, expectant. The elderly gentleman in the tailored suit hesitated only a second before placing his phone face down in the waiting hand. The woman in the burgundy dress followed without prompting. Then the others. One by one, devices were collected and placed in a neat stack on the side table near the door. No one protested. No one asked why. The room understood instinctively that certain kinds of power do not require explanation. Victor watched the confiscation with growing unease, his hand instinctively moving toward his own phone before he thought better of it. The gesture did not go unnoticed. One of Kang's men moved closer, not threatening, simply present. Victor's hand returned to his side. This is illegal, Victor said, his voice attempting authority, but landing somewhere closer to desperation. You can't just, people have rights. I have rights. You're holding us here against our will. Kong turned slowly to face him, his expression still unchanged, still neutral, still measuring. You are not being held, Kong said quietly. You are being witnessed. There is a difference. He stepped closer to Victor, maintaining careful distance, not crowding, simply occupying space with the kind of presence that makes people step back without being pushed. Victor held his ground, but his shoulders tensed. Let me outline what has happened tonight, Kong continued, his tone conversational, almost educational. You assaulted a service worker in a room containing 17 witnesses. 12 of them are visible on security cameras that recorded the entire incident. 3 of those witnesses are international business partners who cannot afford association with public violence. Medical personnel are currently documenting injuries consistent with assault. Police will be contacted. Reports will be filed. He paused, letting each fact settle like a stone dropped into still water. These are not threats, Mr. Hale. They are circumstances. They exist whether I speak them or not. Victor's face had gone from red to pale. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, for someone who would contradict this calm recitation of his collapsing reality. The other executives at his table studied their hands, their plates, the tablecloth. Anywhere but his face. I can explain, Victor started. It was an accident. She bled. Kang interrupted softly. Explanations do not unbleed. One of Kang's men moved behind Victor, close enough to be felt without being touched. Another approached from the side. Not aggressive. Not violent. Simply present, occupying space, creating geometry that suggested inevitability. Sit, Kang said. The word was not shouted. It was stated. Victor remained standing, his jaw clenched, his pride warring with his rapidly developing sense that resistance would not serve him. The hand on his shoulder was not rough. It was simply firm, guiding downward with pressure that communicated certainty rather than force. Victor's knees bent involuntarily. He sank into the chair, then further, his body continuing its descent until his knees made contact with the carpet. He knelt there, breath coming fast, face flushed with humiliation and rage, and something closer to fear. Around him, 17 witnesses watched in silence. No one moved to help him. No one looked away. Kang circled him slowly, hands clasped behind his back, his voice remaining level and measured. This is not revenge, he said. It is balance. You used your position to harm someone without power. Now you experience what it means to be without power in a room that has made its judgment. The sound of the ambulance siren grew louder, then stopped outside. Paramedics entered with practiced urgency, moving past the sealed room's new boundaries without question. They knelt beside Aisha, checking vitals, asking questions she answered weakly. A neck brace was fitted. The stretcher was positioned carefully. Victor watched from his knees as Aisha was lifted, secured, wheeled toward the exit. Her eyes found his face for just a moment. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something more devastating. Recognition that his power over her had ended. The door closed behind the paramedics. The room remained sealed. Victor remained kneeling. The witnesses remained silent. Kang reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone with deliberate slowness. He selected a number, held the phone to his ear, and waited for the connection. When someone answered, his voice remained quiet but carried clearly across the hushed space. This is Kang Min-jae, he said. I need you to check something for me. A Victor Hale. Pending acquisitions. Partnership agreements. Anything requiring investor confidence. He paused, listening. Yes. Now would be appropriate. He ended the call and looked down at Victor, still kneeling, still breathing hard, still beginning to understand how much worse this night was about to become. That was the first call, Kang said simply. There will be others. The response came faster than Victor expected. His phone, still in his pocket despite the collection of others, began vibrating within minutes. Then again. Then continuously. When one of Kang's men gestured for him to check it, Victor pulled it out with trembling fingers. 7 missed calls. All from his CFO. 3 text messages. The first read, Partners withdrawing from Singapore deal. Need you now. The second, Henderson pulled out completely. What the hell happened? The third sent just seconds ago. Legal is freaking out. Multiple investors requesting emergency calls. Victor's acquisition, 18 months of negotiation, 60 million in projected value. His entrance into Southeast Asian markets was collapsing in real time. The partners who had been courting him for months, who had flown in for this dinner, were already calculating distance. Association with public violence, with assault charges, with footage that would inevitably surface. It was a contamination they could not afford. He tried to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. I need to make calls. I need to fix this. You don't understand what you've. Sit, Kang said again. The word carried the same quiet finality as before. Victor remained on his knees. He began dialing anyway, his fingers fumbling over the screen. The first lawyer he reached sounded confident until Victor explained the situation. Witnesses, cameras, assault of a service worker, foreign business partners present. The confidence evaporated. The lawyer recommended a colleague who specialized in crisis management. That lawyer recommended someone else. Each referral came with the unspoken message. This is worse than you think. Victor tried his usual fixer next. A man who had smoothed over 2 DUIs, a harassment complaint from a former employee, and a near scandal involving campaign contributions. The fixer listened in silence, then spoke carefully. I can't make 17 witnesses disappear, Victor. I can't erase security footage that's already been copied. And I definitely can't make this go away if the people involved don't want it to go away. He paused. Who exactly are you dealing with? Victor looked up at Kong, who stood calmly nearby, checking his own phone with the unhurried attention of someone reading weather reports. I don't know, Victor admitted quietly. Then you're already lost, the fixer said, and ended the call. Kong made his second call. This one was brief, professional, matter of fact. He provided an address, a situation summary, and a statement that witnesses were secured and willing to provide testimony. He mentioned medical documentation being prepared. He mentioned video evidence. He did not mention his name. When asked about his involvement, he simply said he was a patron who had witnessed the incident and felt obligated to report it. The police arrived 23 minutes later. Not with sirens. Not with drama. 2 detectives in unmarked cars, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had processed dozens of assault cases and understood that wealth did not exempt anyone from procedure. They spoke to witnesses individually. They collected contact information. They reviewed preliminary security footage with the restaurant manager, who had stopped calculating damage control and started calculating legal compliance. They photographed the blood still visible on the marble floor, the displaced chair, the table edge that showed signs of impact. When they approached Victor, still kneeling because no one had told him he could stand, they were polite but firm. They read him his rights. They asked if he understood. They waited for his acknowledgement. Then they asked him to stand, to place his hands behind his back, to comply with the arrest procedure. Victor's lawyers arrived as he was being let out, shouting about unlawful detention, demanding to see warrant paperwork, threatening procedural violations. The detectives handed them business cards and continued walking. Victor was placed in the back of an unmarked car, his tailored suit creasing against the seat, his wrists secured with handcuffs that did not care about net worth. By the time the car pulled away, 3 news vans had already arrived. Someone had tipped them off, probably multiple someones. Cameras captured Victor's profile through the tinted windows. Reporters shouted questions at the detectives, who ignored them professionally. The story was already forming. Millionaire arrested after assaulting waitress at exclusive restaurant. The details would come later. The judgment was already spreading. Inside the restaurant, Kong remained. He spoke quietly with the manager, producing a credit card and requesting the check, not just for his table, but for every table in the private dining area. He added a gratuity that exceeded the total bill. Then he requested a separate envelope. For the staff who witnessed this, he explained. Distributed evenly among everyone working tonight. The manager accepted with shaking hands and genuine gratitude. Kong made 3 more calls before leaving. The first was to the hospital where Aisha had been taken, providing insurance information that would cover all medical expenses without requiring her to navigate billing. The second was to a law firm that specialized in employment and assault cases, arranging consultation without obligation or upfront cost. The third was to his own people, ensuring that someone would check on Aisha's recovery and confirm she had what she needed. He gathered his jacket from where the paramedics had left it, brushed off the marble dust, and walked toward the exit. The manager followed him, still processing what had unfolded. Sir, the manager said hesitantly, I don't know what you did tonight. Kong turned, his expression still neutral, still measured. This is not charity, he said quietly. It is correction. When systems fail to protect people, someone must step in. Tonight I was here. That is all. He walked out into the night, leaving behind a sealed room of witnesses who would never forget. A woman in a hospital bed who had been seen, and a man in handcuffs who had finally learned that some consequences move quietly but arrive completely. Aisha spent 3 days in the hospital. The physical injuries were documented with clinical precision. Laceration to the right temple requiring 7 stitches, mild concussion, severe bruising along her left hip and shoulder, minor internal bleeding that stabilized with observation. The psychological injuries were harder to quantify but evident in the way she startled when doors opened unexpectedly, the way her hands trembled when signing discharge papers, the way she asked twice if she was safe before accepting a ride home. Her sister stayed with her for the first week. Aisha did not talk much about that night. Not because she could not, but because speaking it aloud made it real in a way that silence kept manageable. She dreamed about the fall, woke with her hand pressed to her temple checking for blood that was no longer there. But she also woke each morning, got dressed, ate breakfast. Small acts of normalcy that felt like defiance. The legal process began without drama. A prosecutor was assigned, reviewed the case file, and recognized immediately that this was not a matter of interpretation. The evidence was overwhelming and redundant. 3 separate forms of documentation all confirming the same sequence of events. The medical report was damning in its objectivity. Injury patterns consistent with being shoved backward. Impact trajectory matching the table edge. Photographs of bruising that showed handprints on her shoulders, clear enough to measure finger spacing. The attending physician's notes included observations about Aisha's demeanor. Cooperative, frightened, reluctant to press charges until assured she would be protected. Security footage provided the timeline. 3 cameras had captured angles of the incident. The prosecution reviewed them frame by frame. Victor standing, grabbing Aisha's wrist, shoving her, standing over her as she bled, adjusting his cufflinks while she remained on the floor. No ambiguity. No alternative interpretation. 17 seconds that could not be explained away. Witness statements arrived steadily over 2 weeks. 12 people provided written testimony. 5 agreed to testify in person if needed. Their accounts aligned with unsettling consistency. The confrontation, the language used, the physical contact, the blood, the silence afterward. Several mentioned Victor's expectation that others would validate his actions. 2 mentioned the foreign businessman who had intervened. None could be pressured to change their story because their stories were simply descriptions of what they had seen. Victor's defense team, now his 3rd set of lawyers after the first 2 withdrew citing conflicts, attempted multiple strategies. They filed motions to suppress the security footage on technical grounds. Improper chain of custody, lack of signed consent from diners, privacy violations in a private dining space. Each motion was denied. The footage had been handled correctly. The space, while reserved, was still subject to restaurant security protocols. Privacy does not protect assault. They attempted to reframe the narrative. Victor had been under immense stress. Business pressures. Personal struggles. The steak had been cold, service inadequate, his reaction disproportionate, but not criminal. An accident, a moment of poor judgment, not assault. They suggested Aisha had stumbled, that Victor had reached out to steady her and been misinterpreted. The medical evidence contradicted this immediately. Stumbling does not leave handprints. Steadying someone does not cause them to fly backward into furniture. The physics did not support the story. They tried character attacks next, carefully worded to avoid obvious discrimination, but designed to plant doubt. Questions about Aisha's employment history, whether she had filed complaints before, whether she had financial motivation to exaggerate. Her lawyer shut this down efficiently, providing employment records showing 3 years of exemplary service, 0 complaints, consistent performance reviews. The insinuation collapsed under the weight of documentation. Victor's team requested delays, filed for changes of venue, argued that media coverage had poisoned potential jury pools. Each request was considered and denied. The case was straightforward. The evidence was clear. The timeline was public record. Delay served no legitimate legal purpose. What they could not overcome was the sheer volume of corroboration. 17 witnesses, 3 cameras, 1 medical report, all telling the same story. Defense strategy depends on creating reasonable doubt. There was no doubt to create. Every angle had been covered. Every potential contradiction had been eliminated before the defense even saw the file. Mr. Kang's name appeared nowhere in the legal documents. He had given a witness statement like everyone else present that night, brief, factual, offering no opinions, just observations. He was not called to testify. He did not need to be. His intervention had been personal, not legal. The law had its own momentum now. The trial date was set for 4 months out. Standard scheduling, nothing rushed, nothing exceptional. Victor's lawyers informed him with barely concealed resignation. They could continue to file motions, but the outcome was increasingly inevitable. Settlement discussions had been attempted. Aisha's legal team had declined. She wanted accountability, not money. Victor sat in his lawyer's office, watching the late afternoon sun slant through the windows, and understood finally that this would not disappear. No amount of money, no connection, no reputation could erase 17 witnesses and 3 camera angles. The room that night had made its judgment. The legal system was simply formalizing what had already been decided. For the first time since that evening, Victor Hale felt the full weight of permanence. This would go to trial. He would sit in that courtroom, and everyone would see what 17 people had already seen. A man who believed power meant immunity, learning that it did not. The prosecution strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Tell the truth chronologically and let the evidence speak. No theatrical presentations. No emotion el manipulation. Just a clear timeline supported by documentation that could not be disputed. The prosecutor, a veteran named Sandra Chin, opened with 3 sentences. On the evening of March 15th, Victor Hale assaulted Aisha Thompson in front of 17 witnesses. The assault was captured on 3 security cameras. Medical professionals documented injuries consistent with violent physical contact. Everything else is context. Victor's defense team had prepared for aggression, for dramatic accusations, for a case built on emotion. They had not prepared for this kind of clinical precision. Their planned counterattacks, challenging credibility, questioning interpretations, creating alternative narratives, required ambiguity that did not exist. The first witness was the restaurant manager. He testified about security protocols, about the private dining room's camera placement, about his immediate call for medical assistance. He described Victor's demeanor afterward. Not shocked, not apologetic, but annoyed at the disruption. Under cross-examination, the defense tried to suggest the manager was protecting the restaurant's reputation by exaggerating. The manager calmly referenced his written statement from that night, provided before any lawsuit was filed, matching his current testimony word for word. The waitstaff came next. 3 servers who had been working that evening, including one who had been standing near the kitchen entrance and witnessed the entire confrontation. Their testimonies aligned without appearing rehearsed. Small differences in which details they notice first, but unanimous agreement on the sequence of events. Victor stood. Victor grabbed Aisha's wrist. Victor shoved her. Aisha fell. Blood appeared. Victor adjusted his cufflinks. The defense attempted to paint them as biased, as protecting a co-worker, as having financial motivation given the civil suit pending. The prosecutor addressed this directly. Of course they care about their co-worker. That does not make their eyes unreliable, or their memory false. They saw what they saw. 2 diners testified. The elderly gentleman in the tailored suit described the scene with the precision of someone accustomed to observing details. He had been a federal judge before retirement. His credibility was unimpeachable. The woman in the burgundy dress, a corporate attorney, provided similar testimony. Both noted that other diners had reached for phones but hesitated to record. Not because the assault was ambiguous, but because the room's atmosphere had shifted into something dangerous and uncertain. The defense tried once to suggest mass hysteria, group delusion, witnesses influencing each other's memories. The prosecutor simply played the security footage. 17 seconds. No audio needed. The images told the story the witnesses had already confirmed. The medical testimony was devastating. The emergency room physician walked the jury through Aisha's injuries with photographs projected on screens. He explained impact patterns, showed how the bruising on her shoulders matched hand placement, demonstrated the angle of the laceration consistent with striking a table edge. He noted her psychological state upon arrival. Frightened, shaking, asking repeatedly if she was safe. These are not the responses of someone who stumbled, he said. These are the responses of someone who was attacked. Throughout the proceedings, media coverage intensified. Headlines evolved from neutral reporting to clear framing. Millionaire on trial for assault of waitress. Surveillance footage shows restaurant attack. 17 witnesses testify against wealthy businessman. Victor's carefully cultivated image. The self-made success story, the generous donor, the respected investor, collapsed under the weight of documented violence. His business partners issued statements distancing themselves. Charities returned donations. Board positions were quietly vacated. The social architecture that had supported his rise dismantled itself with the same efficiency it had been built. On the fourth day of trial, during a recess, Victor's lead attorney approached the prosecution with a final offer. A plea agreement. Reduced charges. Financial restitution. Public apology. Anything to avoid a verdict that would be permanent and public. Sandra Chun listened without expression, then made a brief phone call. When she returned, her answer was simple. My client declines. She wants the jury to decide. Victor's team tried to reach Mr. Kong through various channels. Business contacts, intermediaries, carefully worded inquiries about whether influence could be applied. Every attempt met silence. Kong had given his witness statement. He had ensured Aisha had legal representation and medical care. Beyond that, he had stepped back completely. This was the law's process now, not his. The defense rested after 3 days, their case thin and desperate. They had argued stress, misunderstanding, accident, misinterpretation. The jury had watched security footage that contradicted all of it. Closing arguments were brief. The prosecutor reminded the jury that wealth does not grant immunity from consequences. The defense pleaded for compassion, for understanding that good people make mistakes. The judge provided instructions on assault law, on burden of proof, on how to evaluate evidence. The jury retired to deliberate at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon. The courtroom emptied slowly. Victor sat beside his lawyers, his expensive suit somehow looking cheaper under the fluorescent lights. Aisha sat across the aisle with her legal team, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. Outside, reporters waited with cameras ready. Inside, 12 people reviewed photographs, watched footage again, discussed what qualified as reasonable doubt when 17 witnesses and 3 cameras told the same story. Victor stared at the wall and waited for a verdict that felt increasingly inevitable. Money had bought him lawyers. It had bought him delays. It had bought him a defense strategy that attempted every possible angle. What it could not buy was a jury's willingness to ignore what they had seen with their own eyes. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 17 minutes. When the bailiff announced they had reached a verdict, the courtroom filled quickly with the controlled urgency of people who understood they were about to witness resolution. Victor sat rigid in his chair, his lawyers flanking him with expressions that had moved beyond confident reassurance into professional detachment. Across the aisle, Aisha sat with her hands folded, her sister beside her, both women silent and still. The jury filed in without drama. 12 faces carefully neutral, trained by instruction to reveal nothing before the verdict was read. The forewoman, a middle-aged teacher wearing reading glasses, handed the folded paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Catherine Morrison unfolded the document, read it without expression, and looked out over the courtroom. The defendant will rise. Victor stood. His legs held him barely. His lawyer stood beside him, one hand hovering near Victor's elbow as if anticipating collapse. In the matter of the state versus Victor Hale, on the charge of aggravated assault, how does the jury find? The forewoman's voice was steady, clear, and final. We find the defendant guilty. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. No gasps. No outbursts. Just the ripple of consequence spreading outward through the room. Victor's face went pale, then red, then pale again. His mouth opened but no words emerged. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture meant to steady but looking more like restraint. Behind them, reporters typed furiously into phones. In the gallery, witnesses from that night exchanged glances that communicated validation rather than celebration. Aisha closed her eyes briefly, exhaled slowly, and opened them again. Judge Morrison continued without pause. The court thanks the jury for their service. Sentencing will be scheduled for 3 weeks from today. The defendant will remain free on bail until that time, with all previous conditions maintained. The gavel fell once. The sound was soft but absolute. 3 weeks later, the courtroom reconvened. Victor had lost weight. His suit hung differently, his face looked older, his confidence had eroded into something closer to resignation. The sentencing hearing was brief and procedural. Judge Morrison reviewed the case facts, the jury's finding, the sentencing guidelines for aggravated assault. She noted the evidence of premeditation, not in planning the assault, but in the power dynamic that preceded it, the public humiliation that escalated to violence, the expectation that status would erase accountability. "Mr. Hale," she said, looking directly at him, "you used your position to harm someone who could not defend herself. You did so publicly, violently, and without remorse. The court finds that imprisonment is necessary both for punishment and to demonstrate that wealth does not immunize against consequence." The sentence was delivered without theatrics. 3 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. Credit for time served, none, as he had remained free on bail. Mandatory anger management counseling. Permanent criminal record. Then came the civil component. The damages hearing had proceeded parallel to the criminal case. Aisha's attorney had documented medical expenses, lost wages, ongoing psychological treatment, and the broader impact on her ability to feel safe in service work. The final amount was substantial, not enough to bankrupt Victor completely, but enough to dismantle the empire he had built on intimidation and unchecked power. Victor was ordered to pay $675,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. His accounts would be monitored. Payment plans were mandatory. Failure to comply would result in additional legal action. When Judge Morrison asked if he had anything to say, Victor's lawyer advised him to decline. Victor looked at Aisha for the first time since the verdict. She met his gaze without flinching. He opened his mouth, closed it, and shook his head. No speech. No apology. No final attempt to reclaim narrative control. Then this court is adjourned. 2 bailiffs approached Victor with handcuffs. He extended his wrists automatically, muscle memory from processing overriding his ego. The metal clicked into place. He was led through the side door, away from cameras, away from reporters, toward the transport that would take him to intake processing at the state correctional facility. The courtroom emptied slowly. Aisha remained seated until most people had left, then stood with her sister's help and walked out through the main doors. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Her lawyer provided a brief statement on her behalf. Justice was served today. Ms. Thompson is grateful to everyone who stood as witnesses and told the truth. Aisha said nothing. She did not need to. Across the city, in an office with windows overlooking the financial district, Kang Min-jae received a text message containing 2 words. Guilty. Sentenced. He read it without expression, set down his phone, and returned to the contract he had been reviewing. His assistant, seeing his face, knew better than to ask questions. Some matters required intervention. Others simply required patience while systems functioned as designed. Kang had not attended the trial. He had not followed media coverage closely. He had ensured Aisha had resources and protection, then stepped back to let justice proceed without his shadow influencing outcomes. His role had been correction, not control. The law had done its work. Outside his window, the city continued its rhythm. Transactions completed. Agreements signed. Workers moved through buildings serving people who rarely acknowledged them. Some of those people had learned, through headlines and testimony, that invisibility was not the same as worthlessness. Others had not. Kang returned to his work, unmoved by the verdict because he had known it was inevitable. Evidence had spoken. Witnesses had testified. A jury had decided. A judge had sentenced. Justice had not raised its voice. It had simply arrived, measured and absolute, exactly as it should. 6 months after the verdict, Aisha Thompson stood behind the counter of a small cafe 3 blocks from her apartment. The space was nothing like Le Marais. No crystal chandeliers, no private dining rooms, no clientele who expected the world to rearrange itself around their presence. Just neighborhood regulars, decent tips, and a manager who remembered staff birthdays. She worked mornings now, not evenings. She had learned that certain hours carried weight her body remembered even when her mind had moved forward. Morning light felt safer. Breakfast crowds were kinder. The rhythm was gentler. The nightmares had decreased. Therapy helped. Time helped more. She had learned to recognize triggers. Loud voices in enclosed spaces, the sound of chairs scraping abruptly, men in expensive suits who spoke to service workers like they were furniture. She managed these moments now instead of being managed by them. Reporters had reached out repeatedly in the months following the trial. Interview requests. Documentary producers. A literary agent interested in a memoir. National news programs wanting her to share her story. To become a voice for service workers facing abuse. To turn her trauma into platform. She declined them all. "I don't need to be famous," she told her sister over coffee one Saturday morning. "I needed to be believed. I was. That's enough." The civil damages had been paid in installments, monitored by the court. The money sat in an account Aisha rarely thought about. She had used some for medical bills not covered by the arrangement Kong had made. Some went to her sister, who had taken unpaid leave to stay with her during recovery. The rest remained untouched, earning interest, waiting for a purpose she had not yet defined. She was not waiting to forgive Victor. Forgiveness required him to matter, and he had become irrelevant to her healing. She was simply living, working, sleeping, rebuilding the sense of safety that violence had stolen. Victor Hale's life had been reduced to routine. Wake at 6. Breakfast in the common area. Work assignment in the prison library. Lunch. Recreation hour he spent walking the perimeter of the yard alone. Dinner. Lights out at 10. His lawyers had filed appeals. All were denied. His business empire had been liquidated to cover debts, legal fees, and the civil judgment. His name, once associated with success and influence, now appeared primarily in case law textbooks and articles about workplace violence. He had visitors occasionally. His ex-wife came once, signed divorce papers across a table in the visiting room, and never returned. A former business partner visited to finalize the dissolution of their remaining shared holdings. No one came for comfort or reconciliation. They came to close accounts. Victor understood, in the way that forced idleness creates understanding, that he had spent decades confusing power with immunity. He had believed money purchased exemption from consequence, that status granted permission to treat people as objects, that the world would always bend to accommodate his anger. The world had not bent. It had simply stopped accommodating. Kong Min-jae never appeared in Aisha's life again after ensuring she had legal representation and medical coverage. He did not check in. He did not ask for gratitude. He had corrected an imbalance and returned to his own concerns. His business continued. His reputation remained what it had always been. Quiet, effective, not to be tested. The story of what happened at Le Marais circulated in certain circles as a reminder. Some people notice. Some people act. Some people do not forgive violence against those without power to defend themselves. But Kong did not discuss it. He had not acted for recognition. He had acted because a woman was bleeding on a floor while a room full of people calculated whether helping her was worth the risk. He had removed the calculation. The rest had been inevitable. Years later, when Aisha trained new staff at the cafe, she emphasized boundaries with the calm authority of someone who had learned their importance the hard way. She taught them that respect was not optional, that service was not servitude, that no tip was worth their dignity or safety. If someone crosses a line, she told a young server during his first week, you don't have to absorb it. You can walk away. You can get management. You can refuse service. You are not invisible just because you're working. The server nodded, unsure if he would remember this advice when faced with a difficult customer. But Aisha remembered. And in remembering, she had transformed what happened to her from a wound into a boundary. Not just for herself, but for everyone who came after. Power, Aisha had learned, was often misunderstood. People mistook volume for authority, aggression for strength, money for immunity. Real power was quieter. It was the ability to change circumstances, to protect rather than dominate, to correct rather than control. Silence, too, was misunderstood. Silence was not always submission. Sometimes it was observation. Sometimes it was calculation. Sometimes it was the space before correction arrived, measured and inevitable. Victor had shouted. He had performed dominance. He had expected compliance. Kong had observed. He had acted with precision. He had created consequences. The difference had been everything. In the circles where power once mistook itself for immunity, a new understanding settled quietly. Some people don't shout. They correct.